Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast, where we hear stories and have conversations about life in Christ, everyday discipleship, and exploring ways that we as men can give life to others. I'm Tom Henderson, the founder of RESGEN, and after kicking off Season 3 with Paul Tenhaken, the mayor of Sioux Falls, I just knew the episode following him needed to be another city leader who is providing Christ-like leadership and care, not only for the general public, but to a department of individuals who have a very difficult job. Jon Thum is a husband and a father, and became the chief of police here in Sioux Falls in the fall of 2021. He started his career with the Sioux Falls Police Department as a patrol officer in 2005, and has also worked as a field training officer, a department training officer, a sergeant, lieutenant, and a SWAT commander. Combined, these positions have provided him with a high level of strategic perspective and expertise, both in the facets of law enforcement and in community relations. On today's show, Chief Thum and I discuss how his faith influences how he leads the police department and ways that citizens, like you and me, can encourage and give life to their local police officers. We also discuss what churches and individuals can do better to help the incarcerated and those who are coming out of prison, and how he personally has processed recent movements like defund the police. I am really looking forward to this episode. So here's my conversation with Sioux Falls Police Chief Jon Thum. Well, Chief Jon Thum, man, welcome to the Giving Life Podcast, brother.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to be here. Like I told you, Tom, I saw my dad was on here.
Yes, and, he warmed up. He warmed up the table.
Warmed
for
up
you.
the table for me, you know. And I just like, well, I got to get on this podcast too. So I pulled some strings, did what I had to do to get on this too. Yeah. And so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, this is going to be good. I think it's going to be informative, but hopefully, I think it's something that I think is going to be really beneficial. Hopefully, just even for you and I, but for the listeners in understanding just your world and our world, and how we as just men specifically can be a part of just being a help to officers, our communities, all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited about that. Before we get into all that, I do think it'd be beneficial for us to have a little introduction, because a lot of the people, they probably will have not met you.
Sure.
And so I think let's just quickly give a rundown as to who you are, family. I talked about just the different positions you've held with the department since 2005.
Yep.
But anyway, so just roll into that.
Yeah, so I've got the long version and the short version, but they all end up being long.
Okay.
But I'll just go into it. But no, my name's Jon Thum. Well, Jonathan Thum, if my mom's listening, right? Because that's my given name, and she likes to make sure I use that.
Nice.
But married, my wife Melissa. I've got 3 kids, all boys: Jonah, Roman, and Eli. 11, 10, and 8.
Yeah.
And so that's the family where I'm at. And I'm a twin brother who's an identical twin.
Yep.
And then a little brother in town. And then my mom and dad are in town. But the people used to always give me a lot of, guff, because I have 2 brothers that are doctors, and then of course me. And then, at the time, when I was fielding these questions a lot, I was a police sergeant. And they're like, well, what happened to you? I'm like, I got hit in the head a lot. I got hit in the head a lot of head injuries. The math and science portion of my brain just didn't work, from football and other assorted young male activities. But then when I became chief, my twin brother's coworkers started giving him a hard time, because he's like, wait a second. He goes, your one brother's a surgeon, he's a urologist. Yeah. Your other brother's the chief of police, and you're just an anesthesiologist?
Yeah,
because they started to get after him a little bit. And they're like, I guess that makes you the Cooper Manning of the equation, the Manning brothers. So, but I was born and raised in Sioux Falls. Grew up in All Saints neighborhood, Pettigrew Heights, Longfellow, Lowell, Axtell Park, Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And then it came time to kind of pick a college. And of course, my choice was pretty simple. I was an okay high school football player, wanted to play football. My dad was the campus pastor at University of Sioux Falls. Yep. Got a pretty good tuition deal because he was working there. Yeah. Kind of made it a no-brainer to go to University of Sioux Falls. And so went there. Before I got there, wanted to be in law enforcement.
Okay.
My grandpa was a vet, served in the Korean War. My dad was in the Naval Reserve, 20 plus years. And I'm like, when I would take these spiritual gift inventories in church growing up, it always came back to service, like any service-related job or function. And I found, especially through the youth group at First Baptist, when we go places and do trips, like I like to do service work.
Yeah.
And I viewed law enforcement as an extension of that, as a way I could serve my community. But went to USF, and at the end of the day, what 18-year-old actually knows what they want to do?
Right.
And if they say they know what to do, it's going to be different in about 4 years.
It's going to change, exactly.
So there was no criminal justice major, thankfully, and so I picked a business major, because what's the catch-all major that when you can't decide what, you just pick business. And got through towards the end of college, met my wife, Melissa, my future wife. We were going to get married, graduating, and I'm like, I owe it to her to give this Monday through Friday 8 to 5 thing a chance. There's a certain stability to certain professions, and you don't find that in public safety, especially in law enforcement. You are not going to have good days off. You're going to be working differently. And so I'm like, I'll give the sales world a shot. And I forced myself to do it for 2 years. And from a previous experience, I'm like, you will not quit no matter what for 2 years. You will force yourself to do this, even if you don't feel it's the right fit. Because really, if you don't give something your best effort, do you really know if it really was for you or not? So within 3 months, I knew it wasn't where I was supposed to be. Like I'd literally wake up and sometimes throw up before I went to work.
Wow.
Not because my boss treated me great, right? It was not the work setting. Yeah. It was just this feeling of, this is not where you're supposed to be. This is not the work you're supposed to be doing. This is not where your path is. But I'm like, you'll do this for 2 years no matter what. So on the 2-year anniversary of my profession there, I resigned, but I was halfway through the police department application process. A couple months before, my wife's like, you're pretty miserable with your job. And she's like, I'm pretty miserable with my job. She wanted to be a hairstylist, but went and got a journalism degree. Okay. Right. She goes, I'm going to go back to hair school. Why don't you become a cop? I'm like, sounds like a good plan. Yeah. So we both kind of changed our career paths. And again, by that point, I got hired in 2005 at the police department, and she finished hair school shortly thereafter, and we were on to the next chapter of our lives. And I got to the police department, immediately knew that was the fit. That's where I wanted to be. And even though I grew up in Sioux Falls and maybe some of the neighborhoods that people would maybe classify as not the nicest parts of town, I had no idea what actually happened in Sioux Falls till I became a cop. So I saw the calls and started getting the experience, and it just affirmed that's where I wanted to be. And like most cops, I wanted to be a detective. I was 0 for 6 in applications for the detective bureau. Okay. Got shut out. Much like my senior year football career, we went 0 and 9. Winless. That was foreshadowing. Winless foreshadowing. Yeah. Right. And again, where you think you want to be is not necessarily where your skills lie. And what I figured out is I became a training officer, got involved in the SWAT team, and that the training tactical world was really the aspect of policing that I enjoyed and thrived in the most, and served as the department's training officer after about 9 years on patrol. On the SWAT team, tested for sergeant, got sergeant, became SWAT team leader, SWAT team commander, and then got to the point where in 2019, I was selected as lieutenant. Yeah. And fall of that year, I'm like, okay, that's great. I'm a lieutenant after about 14 years in this career, and I got assigned to the special operations support services, but it's traffic, canine, SWAT, bomb, kind of that whole thing. So I got to skip patrol and go to this Monday through Friday 8 to 5 job as a lieutenant. I'm like, that's pretty great. Yeah. What a great gig. And we were really working hard to get ready for the floods of 2020 that were going to come. Yep. And tons of tons of energy put into that. And then in February, we had a meeting. We're like, oh, there's not going to be any floods. I'm like, my job got even easier, right? And this new role I was taking on. And then shortly thereafter, COVID hit. I found out that was my responsibility for our department. Okay. And then kind of the unrest that followed in 2020 was my responsibility. As our section dealt with those issues too. So got to the point where Chief Burns announced his retirement in 2021. And I kind of said, well, listen to where you're being led and put your money where your mouth is. And really, if you feel this is the path for you, put your name in and for that chief position. And here we sit today. I'm about a year into being chief of police, and it's been an eventful year. Yeah. And that's kind of, there's more detail in there. Obviously, we can get into some of the other nuance, but that's the journey of how I got where I'm at. So, well, I think it's helpful just because a lot of times you don't necessarily know all the things that took place to get you to where you are now. And I think that it's very common for us to look at, let's even just
leave the police department for a second, like rock bands, or whatever, and say,
Yep.
man, what would it be like to be the biggest rock band in the world? Well, what you didn't see is all the work that they put in on the front end of traveling around and sleeping in a van for years or whatever, and doing like local dive shows or whatever before they get into stadiums. And so like learning the story of just how you arrived as chief of police, I think is helpful, even just for people to understand, like, oh, there's a lot of steps and a lot of things that transpired. And I think it's also helpful, like I didn't know that 0 for 6 story, but that not everything always comes easy.
No, and exactly. And you think if you look at, if I could give stories or examples or a theme, like you really have to be open to where your path is being led, and you can fight against it and decide what your maybe path is, and that this is the way it needs to go, and this is the way I need to have it. But there's a lot of, I guess, almost freedom in surrendering it, right? Mm-hmm. And just being open to what comes your way, being open to where you're led and open to where you're called, and not really, it's not just you that gets to determine your path. I mean, there's some other external factors and some other factors there that you have to just be open to where paths open and where you want to take them. And I think that's kind of a story for a lot of our lives is, again, it goes back to that 18-year-old who really thinks that he has it figured out as to where they need to be and where they're headed. Mm-hmm. Well, I challenge you to find the 18-year-old who has set that exact course at 18 and was able to hold that and make that happen. They're few and far between. Most of us have a wandering, meandering journey as to where we are today.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I think that was pretty cool that got allowed to have happen in your situation was that your wife was very supportive from the very beginning. Yeah. Because that's a question I think that a lot of us have is, what is it like for the family of an officer? Yeah. For a wife and child or kids to know that, okay, dad's going to go out or mom's going to go out if it's the other, because there's obviously female officers as well. But in this case, dad's going to go out and go on patrol. Who knows what could happen tonight? Yeah. And there could be a fear, and maybe most experience that at times, a fear of, could something happen to my husband tonight? Yeah.
And there has to be. And when we do new hires, we're like, okay, you have to be okay with a couple of facts. Your days off are going to stink. Your hours are going to stink. You're going to miss holidays. You're going to miss family events. And your spouse in particular has to understand that and not necessarily enjoy it, right?
Yeah, sure. Endure it.
Endure it, right? You got to be okay with it. And this job could take your life, right? And these are two things that before you sign up for, you have to really kind of come to terms with, but moving forward. And going forward, if you ever go to a law enforcement retirement, like who always gets thanked is the family, right? The family always gets thanked because none of it happens without the family. And like I said, that's not saying it's easy, but there's numerous situations where, especially being on the SWAT team and being with more responsibility, that you just have to go. It doesn't matter what the day or the hour is, like you have to go because your responsibility calls it. And I remember this one time I had my 3 kids, because my wife's job, we would flip-flop. She would work my days off doing hair, and then so we'd flip-flop our kids. So I'd have them on my days off, and I'm like, hey, Dad's got a special day for you tomorrow, a special surprise. We're going to do something. So I built it all up, kind of built this anticipation. They're like 5, 4, and 3 at the moment, like just little kids. And I'm like, hey, we're going to the movie theater. We're going to watch Secret Life of Pets or something. The first one came out. So I get them in the car, drive 2 blocks down the street, and pager goes off. There's a SWAT call out, right? So we can't go. And I'm driving back, and the kids are crying, right? And you're like, this is what you try to have them understand, but they're too little to understand. But there's a sacrifice that has to be made, and that story plays out in numerous ways for numerous people in law enforcement and other professions that require that immediate action. And without that sacrifice, and again, like there's just been times where my wife has just been like, I'll figure it out. You go. Yeah. And that's where...
Because she gets it.
Because she gets it, right? Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean like there's not some talking that has to take place too, right? Because we're all allowed the human element of frustration, right?
No question, yeah.
But at the end of the day, you understand the joint mission of what's happening and what's taking place, and you have to work through it together. And it doesn't work unless you work through it together. And I think...
So with those kinds of things, and I think even over the last couple of years, as we've seen, there's been no shortage, Paul Tenhagen was our first episode that was just prior to this one, and we talked about there's no shortage of polarizing topics. There's no shortage of things that are causing division in our families, in our communities, in our world. And so with all of that going on, with things, I want to get into your personal kind of feelings about just the whole defund the police personally, but like with even just that movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and all those kinds of things, have those made it more difficult to retain officers or to attract officers, or how has that impacted?
Well, there's a couple things that are really at play here. And so as of right now, we're authorized at 284 officers. I think as of today, we have around 270.
And is that pretty normal for most cities, John, where it's like so many officers per capita?
So
or
some communities are tied to a number, and like 1 point whatever, we're about 1.4. Other cities, bigger metros, are almost 2 per 1,000.
Okay.
But the reality is that we try to compare communities, and we really can't. Like, so what we look at is just our sustained growth of our community from where we were, what we've had, and where we're headed, and make sure we're just trying to meet that growth from year to year. At the end of the day, you could always find more work, right? But there's only so many positions available, and you have to kind of work through that. And what we've seen, like in the past couple of years, is that it's been far worse in other places. But there's been a definite hit to the number of applicants for the police department. You couple that with just the shortage of workers industries wide, right?
Yeah.
From all the different industries in town, you'll find a help wanted sign. So it's really across all fields, but especially for ours. And I think we've seen people come to our department from other parts of the country, and a lot of them haven't been very successful, but some have just realized that they're just burned out of law enforcement. Like it's hard to maintain that, especially coming from some of the environments they've been in. And I say, if you look at this community, especially in 2020, was it a difficult year for law enforcement? Absolutely. And is it probably the year I got the most obscenities hurled at me, amongst other things?
Yeah.
And, just random middle fingers as people were driving by me, and just,
Bricks and rocks at the Empire Mall all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's probably the year I've never had more compliments, more thumbs up, more cups of coffee bought for me, more meals picked up. And so I think we talk about policing in Sioux Falls, and it's a different environment. That's not to say it's not challenging, right? But there's a lot of positive that comes in and really steps in. And again, I joke that, during 2020, there was a night when they tried to kill us with rocks and bullets, but then the rest of the community tried to kill us with diabetes in the months that follows, because they kept bringing in food into the police department, and it just continually ways to show their support. And again, that's something we want to work hard to maintain, and that's built over a long period of time. And really is something we have to keep striving for, but we'll always keep pushing. We're just talking about hiring today. We talk about it every day. Who do we have coming in? We've offered bonuses. We've offered other things to try to incentivize that. We're seeing some progress, but when you get to a certain size of an organization, you're always just chasing a number, because there's just enough cyclical turnover that happens.
Right. You have retirements.
Yeah. So a lot of the emphasis is, well, how do we just build interest in law enforcement amongst young people? And that's probably a long-term goal, to have more people within our community interested in law enforcement, so that the pool organically grows from within the community itself. And if I could bottle that, I'd be a multi-million-dollar consultant, and we'd figure that out. But we're just trying to make steps and make investments in youth. Camp we just hosted, other outreach events that we're doing to try to build excitement amongst youth for this profession.
And I think of even like a mutual friend that, obviously he's been with the department a long time, Andy Siebenborn, and I just remember years ago where it was something that was, I don't know if it was in the paper or something, where he saw a bunch of kids playing basketball over kind of near Whittier Middle School, if I'm not mistaken, and he gets out. And I'm sure the kids are like, oh, what's going on or whatever. And then he ends up playing basketball with them, for a decent amount of time. And I think even things like that probably do a lot of things that befriend the police.
Absolutely.
And do damage to things like defund the police. Yeah. So it's befriending as opposed to that.
Well, we talk about like deposits in the community bank account, and that takes place time and time again, where officers get out, interact. It doesn't have to be a broad sweeping program. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It just is these daily interactions that take place, which sometimes carry the most weight. So try to building that within your culture. We've had a pretty good success. In fact, sometimes officers hate being acknowledged for it. And we'll get messages where, hey, here, this officer did this thing great. And they don't want to be publicly acknowledged for it because it's part of who they are and they do it for the right reasons. It's part of their job.
Right.
And so sometimes we're kind of bad self-promoters sometimes in some of the things we do. But sometimes if we don't tell our story, then people don't know, right? And people don't know that here's the steps that are being taken and here's how we can build that trust within the community.
Yeah.
But you had started going down the defund.
Yeah, because I was interested with the whole with that whole movement, especially like just our neighbor, just our neighbor, Minnesota, Minneapolis, and so I just wondered when that whole movement, let's call it a movement, for lack of better words, was really seeming to be a part of the conversation, gaining steam in certain areas of the country. How does that impact? Number one, the department, but also just even you personally, other officers personally, because no one wants to be thought of in the way that sometimes officers are.
Yeah.
So how did you process that and deal with those things?
Well, and sometimes it's the one profession that everybody seems to be an expert in is law enforcement. I mean, like literally, no matter, they've all watched cop shows. Right. So they all know how it should be done, how it shouldn't be done, or what happened, right? And so again, here we were in a bit of a unique position because as this defund movement is growing, we're doubling down as a community and funding a $50 million public safety training center for police, fire, and dispatch. And so we were kind of counter to those narratives. And what we know as law enforcement is that we are not an agent of societal change. Like we are simply dealing with the symptoms of greater issues that are taking place that we end up I equate be the ones that at the grocery store, somebody has to take all the groceries and put them in a bag and they have no really choice how they got there, but that's where we're at. And so there's bigger issues at play as far as addiction, mental health, that really are huge drivers within law enforcement. And those are where more attention needs to be added before you defund anything. Because if society doesn't have a problem or it's not defined a solution for anybody else, law enforcement gets it, which is why we end up with a lot of the tasks that we end up doing. So we're like, well, you're not going to get a better result by decreasing funding and decreasing training. If anything, you're going to get a worse result. But if you want to keep this going, but also put more resources and effort into some of these root cause issues, I hope that by the time I'm done as police chief, and this is extremely naive, that we would need less cops, right? And we would need less cops because the call volume would go down, everything would be down. But until that happens, like that's not going to be the case. And it comes up too with defund, and it became an all or none. In all these polarizing issues, we just get to all or none arguments on both sides. Well, it has to be all this way or nothing. The reality is if this community or any community wants to stand up a entity that handles all homeless or mental health calls, so we don't have to, and in return, you need 8 of our officers' funding, well, sign me up, because there's a dollar cost benefit analysis on this whole thing, right? About how many calls we're taking. But until that's ready to be stood up, right, we're going to keep taking those calls, and we're going to keep doing it because we're the ones that are there to deal with it. And especially when it comes to mental health, there's this perception that somehow we are ill-equipped to handle mental health calls. Well, because we've had to adapt and evolve through our training, over 40% of our officers are specialty CIT trained officers, which is crisis intervention trained officers. All of our officers receive training in mental health. We have a mobile crisis team, which we can call out. We've evolved our profession to the point where we are actually, outside of qualified mental health professionals, uniquely skilled and able to handle mental health calls. And they don't always have great outcomes, but that's the reality of chaos, right? Sometimes things go to chaos. And so, again, if we want to take some of that off our table, though, I'll be happy to let somebody else pick up that in other issues and other communities. We're working on some projects too. So it's just kind of this idea that you could take away and somehow have a better result. If anything, you need to just redouble your efforts towards some of those root causes to really make an impact. So basically, there's less police work, and we'd be happy to. I always joke. People have this impression like, do you know anybody who wants to work harder for the same amount of money? Right. No. If anything, we all want to work less hard for the same amount of money. And so I always joke that it's not like we're looking for more work to pick up. If anything, if we can make some impact in those areas, we'd be outstanding. So.
So, like with movements like that, and then not just that though, over the course of your career, you've interacted with multiple different kinds of people, and sometimes they're great interactions, but then sometimes the people that you're having to deal with, to interact with, to arrest, are just unfortunately there's things that have happened in their life. There's maybe underlying issues, but they're just not great human beings, and you have to intervene. Yeah. You've seen a lot. And we could have hours of podcast stories of things that we don't have time for. But through those dealings and the things that you've experienced, how have you kept yourself from becoming jaded towards humanity? When a lot of times you're dealing with people that maybe are a little bit more belligerent or whatever. Yeah.
And I think if there's this old adage you can kind of go and as you get older in your law enforcement career, maybe just older in life, there's a lot of people who just get crabbier as they get older.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think
we all get cranky as we get older.
Get a little jaded, but it's like you always have to keep perspective. And I think you always remember and never take yourself too seriously. Right, is one thing. And just always look for the lighter side, like the joy in life and the happy things in life, because we have to remember that we are seeing people typically on their worst days. Yeah. Right. And we're seeing different situations and different interactions, and to keep everything in context and understand that, okay, this is what we're dealing with. And it's easy to maybe take this cynical, jaded mindset, but never forget to look for the good that's out there always. Like always look for the good, because there's plenty of good stories as well. But what happens is, and again, this is what we get trapped in right now, is we only focus on the negative. Yeah. Like great stories are bad news, right? Because they don't grab attention. They don't get out there. And so we have to kind of train that perspective. And we've made a huge investment as a department to really invest in our peer support team, which is a big group of officers that in a lot of these situations, which are really critical incidents in nature, there's mandatory defusings, mandatory debriefings. Like you're encouraged to reach out to your peers. In the old days of law enforcement, you would just shove that deep down inside, or it would safely go in a box, but then emerge someday to really do damage, right? To your psyche. But now we have a much more open environment where we really talk about what's out there. And I think that's produced a healthier baseline for us, right? Because we're really taking things and discussing them. And I can think of a couple occasions, and you can say that, but then to practice it is somewhat different. I went on a call one time, and you never know when things are going to affect you, because things change throughout your career. As a young officer, I'd go to calls that involve kids and even like a deceased baby, and that didn't really bother me as much. That was just part of my job. I understood it, and I understood what was there. Well, then I started having kids, and by the grace of God, I managed not to go on one of those calls for a couple of years. And then I went to a call with a deceased baby, and everything changed for me because my situation in life had changed, and because I had kids now.
There's an identification.
And when I heard the cries of that mother, that was the cries of my wife, or that was the cries, and it became like a deeply personal thing. But we had kind of built into this, talk about it, right? So what do? We talk about it right afterwards. We process it. We don't hide those emotions. We work through them, and I think that's a very helpful path, because I equate the law enforcement career, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? And you wouldn't run a marathon if you didn't know it was 26.2 miles. I know this because of all the stickers on people's cars.
Right, exactly. And I know because that's why I haven't run a marathon.
Right. So, but before you start a path on that, you know that it ends, because you wouldn't run indefinitely if you didn't know where the end was. And for some of these professions that take a heavy personal toll, you have to keep focused on that end and focused on your health and how you're going to take care of yourself and your coworkers to get to that point. And I say again, as chief, I have the unique situation to conduct everybody's retirement ceremonies. It is one of the most joyful things I get to do, to watch these officers who have dedicated their careers to their community, and their families dedicated their lives to it too, and to send them out the door, done with their career, mission accomplished, pension secured, right, and on to the next chapter of their life. So I think that's just all part of the package. But it's a difficult road to hoe for sure.
But I think that's a helpful encouragement, because it's easy I think for any of us to look at the news and to look at just our world and become jaded, right?
Yeah.
It's not just officers. It's not just the officer condition. It's just we have people like that. There's guys that work with people in their office that are just jerks, or whatever. And you can just become jaded towards humanity. Or you drive around Sioux Falls and you see how bad our drivers are getting. And you can become just jaded against humanity because of
By the way, I just got done driving from Sioux Falls to St. Augustine, Florida, and back. Don't worry, bad driving is nationwide. I always get this question about, well, are drivers getting worse in Sioux Falls? No, they're bad everywhere. They're bad everywhere.
I remember you said you were doing that trip. That is a long haul, dude. That is a long haul.
But it's important to remember because one of the most impactful books in my life has been Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And it's like one of the quotes, I'll probably quote it wrong now, but it's between stimulus and response lies a space to choose your own actions, to choose your own response to whatever happens, right? And within that, Frankl always talks about the greatest freedom is to choose your attitude in any given circumstance.
Yeah.
Right? You get to choose your attitude. Nobody gets to choose that for you. And those words have always been impactful for me. I'm like, this is my choice. Like, this is my choice on the attitude that I take forward. And I can get handed what I feel is a really bad deal. And maybe I'll feel sorry for myself for a few moments because maybe I'll just allow myself that luxury to say, you know what, this is a bad deal. I wish I didn't have to deal with this. This doesn't seem fair. But you know what? The job's got to get done. Let's move forward. Let's choose to have a great attitude. Let's choose to really be a leader in this role, maybe in this time, and then rather than just let that drag you down and become jaded. So,
we're responsible for our reaction.
Yeah,
exactly. And something else that you said just made me think of and I don't know who was the originator of this this quote, but it just talks about that everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about.
Yeah.
And if we take everything personal, which I think is our temptation, especially in our world today, then we're going to walk around angry.
Yeah,
and we're going to walk around and lash out at everybody because we are the victim. But how do we kind of turn that and say, okay, I don't know what that person's going through. I'm going to try to give them the benefit of the doubt when it's difficult and react accordingly. Yeah,
in law enforcement, that plays out all the time. Like you really see this negative response, right? This negative from the jump or from the word go, really. It becomes this negative experience. And I always kind of carry this mantra, like, I'm going to make it really hard for you to hate me, right? Because you're carrying in a lot of ideas about who I am or what I do. But I'm going to be me, and I'm going to be who I am. And you're really going to have a difficult time disliking me. And that's just a choice you're going to have to make because I'm not going to fall into this or I'm going to get into this petty back and forth. And we're humans. We do from so often. But I'm like, if that's what you're receiving, just choose to take that road that makes it, you know what, this is where I believe I need to be, and this is where I can reflect in many ways what God would want us to reflect in that moment.
Do you think that because I want to talk a little bit more about just your faith, John, and how your faith has influenced just your life and then just you and your career, because you mentioned that your dad was the campus pastor, actually still is the campus pastor for one more year at the University of Sioux Falls. He was my campus pastor. So you're raised in...
By the way, my campus pastor,
too. And he was your campus pastor and your dad.
And I used to get noticed when I didn't show up in chapel, by the way.
Exactly. I'm sure. Much more than other students for sure. And then even in college, you even were, you and I were in youth group together. You're a couple years younger than me, but we were in youth group together. And then you interned at First Baptist and kind of did some ministry and all of that. So your faith has always been important to you. It's always been a key component of your life. And so how has your faith impacted, I'm sure it's impacted the way that you view just those that you're serving, our city, and those individuals, but even how you lead the department.
Sure. And I think it comes back to this service call, right? And like you mentioned, there was a period in college, I'm like, Alan Keysbo was my youth pastor. I really thought what he was doing was awesome. Yeah. He invited me to be a middle school youth intern. I'm like, maybe this is the path I want to go. So 2 years of middle school youth ministry was enough to send me right out of that into law enforcement. There's no tougher age to deal with. There's no tougher age to deal with than middle school.
But you still held your 2-year rule.
You
still did it for 2 years.
Never quit anything. And if you quit it well, right? You always got to quit well. And so, but it got to the point where I'm like, okay, well, what is it in me that draws me towards this service? And that's where my period in sales, again, sales is fine if there's purpose within that for you. But again, I think I was denying my call. I was denying what I was being led to do, which is a career of service. So I've always had this mindset of service within my law enforcement career. And in many ways, that's kind of where it got me to where I am, by just always saying, what can I do, right? What can I do to serve? And it may not be what I think I should be doing, whether it's being a detective or being this. This is maybe the best way I can serve the department, and in doing so, best way I can serve the community. And I think for me in my law enforcement career, like faith is what makes it so sustainable for me, right? The faith that I have, and that I know that there's a purpose and there's a plan, and we could get into what exactly, there's a whole theological discussion that goes along with that, but faith has always been there. And then I look at, well, how do we respond to people? Well, relationally is how we build, right? And it's not that, how can you be the best person, right, to the people around you and take care of them in the best way possible. And that's kind of where the principles of faith and just surrendering what you can't control. There's so much that we can get frustrated about. And
that's good.
Like whatever happens next, or whatever happens within the first year of being chief of police, I've had a lot of incidents that we've had to deal with. None of these I can control. I can surrender that to God. I can work through it and trust him for his guidance and his path, but don't lean too heavily on your own understanding, right?
Yeah.
Lean on the people around you and the path that's being laid out for you, and trust that there is a wisdom in the people around you, and wisdom in what your faith has to offer you. And I think that's where it's guided me throughout my career. And again, it's I've also, in some pretty hairy situations, made quite a few deals with God.
It's kind of like the student says, if you'll help me pass this test, I will. I need to get out of this situation.
I need to get out of this situation. I remember being frozen inside an armored vehicle one time in rural South Dakota, making a lot of deals with God to get us out of this one, But again, I think it's the purpose-driven profession, or the purpose-driven, I know there's a book, Purpose-Driven Life, right?
Yeah.
But for me, the faith leading that purpose and that profession is where I'm at. And I have told my family this, like, oh, well, how long are you going to do this job? I'm like, well, I know roughly how long I'll do this job. Yeah. Because the marathon mindset, and also my kids and my wife, my family, they deserve more of me at some point too. Yeah. Because this profession takes a lot out of you. But again, having that purpose and having your family understand that purpose and what's driving you there, again, for me, that's what makes this job enjoyable, right? Like even in all this, like the purpose and the faith that goes with it. So
I love that. I just read an article just like last week that talked about, it was from someone that had achieved a great deal of success in the business world. And they said, what would you go back and tell your younger self? Kind of that 18 to 20-year-old that you were talking about, that says, well, I'm supposed to determine a major right now. I don't even know, like, what I should be doing, like, tomorrow. But he talked about, said, find what you're passionate about, and then seek to do that. And I love that, I mean, you are very passionate about a couple of things: service, which you already mentioned, and then you just mentioned the other one that I know you are, and that's relationship, which I think is so, which is why you are so good at what you're doing, and why God has placed you in this position. Because like you said, over the last year, there has been some things within the department, and unfortunately in our world, this is the stuff that gets the news headlines. They're negative, like you mentioned, not always the positive, not always the basketball playing police officer, but it's the one that is, abuse of power, or, doing something incorrectly as a police officer. And you had to deal with three police officers that had some pretty big indiscretions within a short period of time of your hiring. And so when you and I were talking about that in a previous conversation, I just remember you saying that one of the most important things that you could do at that time was to go and visit with each of your officers. And just have conversation about, hey, how are you doing with this? And working on that relationship. It's
something that, and I went from being very operational in my police career, right? I was out on the street in uniform handling situations. And when you become chief or the head administrator, you have a whole different vibe to your profession. And as an operational officer, I was like, oh, everything's built on relationship. Everything was built on who was out there. And I had great supervisors before me. And I came up with this mantra, people don't follow paper, they follow people, right? It doesn't matter what the policy is, and policy is important, right? But at the end of the day, you follow that person is who you want to work for and where you're at. And relationships make that continuity and have people work together. And so when we were dealing with those tough issues, I'm like, well, how would I want to be dealt with in this situation. I want open honesty and dialogue from the people in charge. And so made it, I'm not sure I got to everybody in the department, but went to every single lineup, every section and corner of the building and said, let's talk about this and let's work through this. And here's where we're at, here's where we're headed. And because those incidents, they hurt us deeply because we value so much our relationship with the community and the reputation that we've built. And
those officers.
Oh, and those officers, right? There's a sense of loss that goes a lot of different ways. And so we worked so hard, and then to see all that happen in short order was just something that was really tough to deal with. But I think we were able to communicate with each other, back to this whole open communication and honesty thing, identify those of us amongst each other who maybe needed some extra conversation or some time to work through it and process it, and handle it on a person-to-person level. You can send out, and here's the thing we get sucked into these days with we've never been more connected but more disconnected because of technology. All right, so we have emails, we have group texts, we have every way to communicate, but there is no substitute for face-to-face interaction, right? For sitting down and to looking into somebody's eyes and seeing that they're dealing with this and this is maybe painful for them too, and taking the time to really talk and make yourself available. And I think that's how, as a society as a whole, we should spend less time, and especially if you talk about divisive issues, arguing about things on Facebook, right? And more time having discussion with each other and really getting to know each other. I think that's a far more beneficial way for us to work through difficulties and hard times. So
yeah, for sure. So there's a couple other things that I just want to touch on before we end our time together, Jon. And one is in regards to the church. Okay, so the whole theme of the Giving Life podcast is men whose life in Christ gives life to others. Okay, and so, but as we look at individuals and as the church, I'm just wondering, are there some things that we can do that will better help, those that are currently in prison, in the jail, or coming out, that are trying to, kind of transition back into society? I think that a lot of times, there's a heart, I wish we could do something. At least there's this thought, whether or not there's, a real amount of energy behind it, I don't know. But there's this side of but there's this loss of, but what does that look like? Is it safe? What's really helpful? What's not?
Yeah.
Because we hear especially about the repeat visitors to prison.
Yep.
Right? Well, we'd like to cut back on repeat visitors. And we'd like to have, like you said, I'd love to not be work myself out of a job.
Yeah.
We'd love to have to not build a bigger prison.
Yeah.
Right? So how... Are there some simple things that we can do or not? I mean,
here's what a lot of what we talk about, and we study crime trends and we study crime rates, and what we see is a lot of repeat offenders and a lot of people who are incarcerated, get in the system early and get out and keep coming and going back and forth. And I think there's a role, and I say the criminal justice system as well, cops, corrections, and courts. In the entire... Everybody focuses on those three things. Well, everything is somewhat limited in that capacity by a lot of things, but it's the 3 C's. The 4th C, though, is community, right? So community steps in, and community really defines how they can help. And whether that's prison ministries is one thing, but my emphasis at this point is, what are we doing to invest in youth and young people right now to provide? It doesn't have to be mentorship, right? But positive role models, positive interactions to really support and build up youth, so they're not even getting in the system.
Yeah,
right.
That's good.
And the pendulum swings right now. The juvenile justice pendulum has kind of swung to one side, and it swings back the other way. But really, we need to talk about grade schoolers, middle schoolers, high schoolers, how we're investing in their lives to really show that this is not the path for them in these areas. And I think it's telling, and that's the hard answer, right? Because we like the quick answer. Well, what can we do within 2 years to make X amount of reduction in recidivism? Well, I don't know, right? But I know if we invest in kids now, we may see 10 years down the road as they get older and they have healthier, more stable conditions, and then they start having kids that are more healthy and stable, and maybe that leads to a point where we're having less of amount of crime. I look at my experience with the neighborhood soccer group lately, which Randall Beck and a few others started, and when I would go and I'd coach at the one closest to my house, which is Spellerberg by the VA, and who was making that happen? Well, Neighborhood Soccer Foundation, the sponsors, Dakota Alliance with some key coaches, and then churches, like who was setting up the nets, who was passing out the meals. It was all local churches that were responsible for getting that piece done. And I think as churches, as we look for ways, and ultimately I think stuff will open itself or present itself on how we interact with youth and invest in youth. And I know other churches have done a good job in prison ministry and things of that nature, but I wish I had this magic answer, but it's be open to where you're being led and open to what opportunities arise to you. And we're all stood and kind of counted. I've always kind of said, I just feel like you better have said you did something. And it may not have worked, right? But at least it was an effort, and at least it went a certain direction. Because I think it'll be easy to sit back and say, well, why is this going this way or this going this way? And I think who should be fixing that? And I think, well, we should be fixing that collectively together. And that's a hard answer, and that's a long path.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good though, because and while we do need to care for those that are in prison and coming out, no question about it, because they 100% matter, and you know, the Lord cares for them just as much as He cares for any of us. But to invest in the kids so that they don't get into that lifestyle is so key. And you think about even just children of those that are incarcerated. And just the whole family component that they're not having, and just, you know, being someone that, you know, had a father in prison, and just saying that, okay, I need to make, you know, better choices to make sure that that's not the road that I travel. Well, largely that was because I had so many other people investing in me. And so how can we be investing in these kids and these high risk individuals so that they don't become the criminals? So that's so good.
We can say it's too hard, but if nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I think people are always looking at, okay, well, what's this huge reduction we can do? Well, let's measure it in individuals, not in percentage points, right? And I think everybody wants to know a success story. Everybody wants to have something, hey, this person, it made a difference for them. And we've seen it within some of our alternative courts, within drug court, vet court, DUI court, where like here's people who a bunch of people invested in. Like if you ever want an interesting experience, go to one of our specialty courts where all these people are investing in individuals, and they're not just numbers, and trying to get them to the point of either sobriety or stability to get them back with their kids. And I think it takes a whole community effort to do that. So,
that's good. I appreciate that. John. All right. One last question. Then I want to give you the opportunity. We do something at the end of our podcast. I'll just give you a little bit of a preview of this so that you kind of be thinking already. It's called the final word. 60 to 90 seconds of just a final word of encouragement, challenge, whatever to listeners. But prior to getting to that, I just want to know, as we just talked about, okay, what are some ways to help those that are incarcerated and their kids and so forth, but what are some simple ways that we can give life to our officers?
Sure.
Because I think it's one of those, like, whenever I see an officer at Bagel Boy, if I'm there at a meeting or I see him around town, one of the things that I often say, and I wonder if it sounds trite, is like, hey, just thanks so much for your work. Just really appreciate your work. Is that meaningful? Is it not? What else can we do to really give life to our officers?
No, I think, like I said, words of encouragement are always appreciated. And it's always one of those things like, hey, appreciate everything you do, or appreciate what you do for our community, and just quick words. And a lot of times, you'll approach an officer maybe who's on break, and they're like, "Oh, what's this person gonna ask me?" Right? Is this going to be about some ticket they got, or about something like this? And it's always appreciated. Like I said, I can't say how many times I've just been sitting at a restaurant or something, and I'm not advocating you pick up their tab, right? But just like all of a sudden some random person just picks something up. We don't even know who they are, right? But these little words of encouragement, these little interjections, even just a thumbs up as you drive by them or something like that. I talked about the community bank account. Well, I think we as human beings all have bank accounts of either positivity or negativity. And anytime you have a chance to positively interact with somebody, not just an officer, but just how can I build this person up a little bit today? What's one thing I can say, or one thing I can really do? And so, like I said, numerous situations where, someone just comes up and says, "Hey, appreciate everything you do." It doesn't have to be like a long-winded conversation. It's actually better.
It's better if it's not. Yeah, exactly.
Because they're probably on their break, or something like that. But it's just like, these are little pick-me-ups that really help. And again, like I said, it's amazing, how much stuff shows up with the police department sometimes in the way of food or baked goods or whatever. And I'm like legitimately, this is bad for our health.
Yeah. Is there a gym that they can work out after they eat all those muffins?
There's a gym. We have health stuff too. So it's good. But again, I can't emphasize enough how we are. And I talk to officers in different departments around the country, how truly blessed we are as a community. Like, officers here know that they're supported by their community, which is, I think, those incidents that we had early in the year with 3 officers getting arrested hurt so bad because we knew that would impact. We were worried how much it would impact. But I can't tell you how, even like after that, words of encouragement and support, and we're like, just how we handled it and who we are as individuals and who we are as officers, how those really help pick us up and say, you know what? Yeah, we got work to do. We'll keep working, but at the same time, our community has our back, and that's an amazing feeling. Yeah. In fact, I still go back to the nights of the riots, and everything happened that happened, and I put a lot of pressure on myself as an individual because I'd done so much community outreach. And I'm like, if this goes bad, like, this is an indictment on everything we've done, right? What we did wasn't good enough, right? All the efforts we took just didn't keep this from happening. And so I got in my car after kind of all the dust settled, and I picked up my phone, and I had like 60 missed text messages, right? Numerous missed calls. And I started scrolling through, and it was just people sending me a message encouraging us, right? And not just me, but all of us, and people I hadn't talked to for years. And all of a sudden, all these text messages start pouring in, and it kind of like shook me out of my little funk. And I'm like, let's get back to work. This is why we do what we do, because the community backs us, and this is who we serve, and so that's kind of those little words of encouragement go a long way. So
all of us, no matter what, that's so good, John, because a quote that I'm going to probably butcher this, but by a guy named Doug Fields, who worked in the youth ministry world a long time. You probably remember him from back in the day when you did youth ministry for the 2 years you did it. Yeah. But that just, he always said, everyone hungers affirmation the way that our body hungers for food. And no matter, that does not have an age limit. And going back to the other quote of you never know what battle someone else is fighting a battle. When you see an officer on the street, they've got stuff going on in their family. Yeah. They've got stuff going on in their world, but yet they're having to serve and protect and care for our community. And so those words of affirmation are so huge. So that's really good. Specific ways that we can pray. How about that? What? Before we get into the final word,
I would just
for
say,
you, your family, just officers, and
for safety, for wisdom, and for understanding. And I think it's just, it doesn't have to be complex, but as police chief, I've never felt more prayed for in my entire life. And it's just this sense, and I'll run into people and like, hey, I'm praying for you every day. And I'm like, I know it, right? And I don't know what you're saying, but it's working. Yeah. Right? I think there's just, officers always need wisdom, because we are in these situations trying to decipher, in either a split second or in the moment, very complicated situation. And I think that's always a prayer that we can fall back on. But like I said, I'll lead that to your heart. I'll lead that to where you're led. Yeah. Because again, you never know what somebody needs at that moment.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. So listeners, just if you are one that prays daily, I just don't think there's anything that is more important for us to be, adding to our prayer list is just our communities, our officers, fire department, all those kinds of all of our.
Yeah, we like the fire department.
Yeah, I know. There's always seems to be like this little fun battle between the police department and the fire department, but it seems like you guys all get along pretty well.
We get along great. In fact, we'd probably discuss other parts of the country because we get along so well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that's such a good reminder to be praying for our officers, for their families, for wisdom, discernment, the ability to just react appropriately in a split second. I think that's a good word, because we don't think about it. A lot of times it has to be a split second decision. Yep. So, all right, John. Well, hey, bro, this has been so good. I can't thank you enough for your time, and I really do think this was a helpful conversation. But I'd love, as we end our time here, 60, 90 seconds, could be shorter, whatever. But what is a final word that you would have for our listeners?
And so, as chief, I get presented with all these complex problems, and they kind of expect us to have the answer. And I'm like, well, the answers are really more complex. There's not simple solutions to a lot of the stuff we deal with. And recently I was talking to a group of middle school kids, and one of the teachers is just like, hey, what's something you can tell the kids that would be important? And I don't know what it was. It just came out, and this is as simple as it can be, is that it doesn't matter what you accomplish in life and what you do or what you achieve. I go, if you're not a good person while you do it, it really doesn't matter, right? The impact that you have as a human being and how you treat other people is far more important than the accolades you receive or the things that you're going to do. And so all this pressure to have your life figured out and all this pressure to plot this course and do what you need to do, especially what we put on young people right now. Well, you know what? Go your way, trust your path, but at the end of the day, just be a good person while you do it. If we all took, some of these middle school kids, I'm like, if we just all took this oath that this is what we were going to do, right? And we were going to call out evil, basically, or call out when people aren't being nice to each other or being mean, or it goes to everything from drugs to gun violence to addiction to everything. If we all just took this pledge that we're just going to be good people no matter what we do, well, the world would be a better place. Extremely simplistic, extremely like, you know, maybe making it too simple, but I just like this group of middle school kids. I'm like, if you could just embody this, you know, like this is where really we could change the world, you know. But,
well, sometimes we make things too complex. And so I think that's a good final word for all of us, because if we all enter each day with that mentality, it would be a better place. Perfect. So, Jon, thank you for being here. Thank you also just for serving our city. And not just as chief, but in all the different roles that you've done, and your consistency in doing so. Because I know that you have been consistent as a person, as a follower of Christ, and you've remained that way throughout your career. And so just thank you for that and the way that you lead the department. And I know it doesn't mean a lot coming from me, but I'm proud of you. And I'm so grateful that you're in the position that you're in. And it has been a true joy. And you said at the beginning of our podcast of, hey, I think I'm going to be a better guest than my dad. And I don't know if I feel comfortable saying exactly that because I just don't want to disappoint your dad either. But you were, I'd say, maybe a hair better.
You know what? Like I said, we joke back and forth, and it used to be my claim to fame. However, still, despite whatever position I hold, I'm always Dennis's kid. Right? That's still my claim to fame. Aren't you Dennis Thum's boy? Yep. Yeah, I'm Dennis Thum's boy. That's awesome. My claim to fame.
All right. Well, Dennis Thum's boy, thank you for being on the podcast today. All right.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jon Thum today. As always, if you found this episode helpful, I encourage you to share it with others that may find it helpful as well. I would also be super grateful if you'd take just 30 seconds to rate and review the podcast. This truly is a huge help as we continue to grow both our audience and the impact of the podcast. If you'd like to connect more with Chief Thum, you can do so through the City of Sioux Falls website, siouxfalls.org. Thanks again for joining me today, everybody, and we'll see you next time for another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast. Until then, continue being men whose life in Christ gives life to others. We'll see you soon.